Hello everyone, welcome to the final part of Before My Heart Gives Out. Be sure to like, share, and check out the author, Kira 1891, as they have some good fan fics and art to check out. The link will be in the description down below. And with that, let's begin. Chapter 28. Count Me In. Ringing. All he could hear was ringing, as if the world had been plunged underwater. The sounds and voices muddled around him, like a distant buzz of white noise he could not decipher. Eyes wide, chest heaving, he could do nothing but stare ahead, gaze just as empty as the space in front of him, which a few seconds, or maybe it could have been an eternity, held his best friend. Shinsu, answer me, damn it. Bakugu's voice filtered through the haze. The teen yelled words at him, but none of them seemed to stick in his mind. As though the boy was speaking a foreign, alien language. His eyes wandered, but never seemed to stay far enough before they were drawn back to that empty space of air, like a compass drawn to its true north. Just a few feet away, only just out of his reach. He could picture it in his mind's eye, his hand outstretched, fingers reaching for the boy he would not be able to save. Not this time, not ever. Todoroki, in contrast, was a solid, cold presence next to him. His calm demeanor was only betrayed by his unnaturally wide eyes. What the hell did you mean? I bags, fucking answer me. Again he watched Bakugu's lips move, sounds erupting from his moving mouth, only for them to fall on deaf ears. His mind only had one thing running through it, an echo that seemed to invade and dominate his thoughts until he could focus on nothing else. Mean by that? Huh? Why did you call him Izuku? Izuku. The whisper trickled from his throat unbidden. Izuku, the words withered and died on his lips. His thoughts were too painful to materialize out loud. Shadow. Midoriya is shadow. Todoroki concluded, voice solemn as he uttered what Shinsu was too much of a coward to say himself. The hell? No, he's not. Bakugu's voice grew more strained by the second, his eyes wild with panic as his gaze flitted between the two teens. He's blind, he's sick. How the fuck would he? This is wrong, Shinsu tried to voice his thoughts, willing his mind to go quiet once again. Willing all these feelings to disappear. I wasn't as supposed to, this is all wrong, he screamed, chest heaving with renewed anger and despair as he looked at his classmates, really seeing them for the first time. He was supposed to be safe here. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this should have happened. He knew what he must have sounded like, his tone hysterical as his word jumbled together. Shinsu, you need to breathe. We can't help him if all we do is panic. We need to be rational about this. We need to find Aizawa and the other heroes. He could pinpoint the exact moment reality settled in Bakugu's mind. Could see it in the way his whole face seemed to crumble, his body swaying slightly, as if it was being held down by an overwhelming weight. He could feel it, mirrored in his own form, as he tried to get up. Take control of the situation, despite the thread that kept trying to unravel and slip from his grasp. Regardless of his hardest attempts for it not to. Shinsu. And wow, he's never heard Bakugu sound so empty before. Explain. And so he did. He told them everything. In broken, sobbing words, as they made their way back to the camp, he told them about Izuku's past, their meeting, finding out he was Shadow. He told them about the boy's powers and their consequences, silent tears streaming down his eyes as he tries to form clear sentences, wanting more than anything for the two to understand just how bad this was. By the time he was done, they had arrived, and both Todoroki and Bakugu had fallen silent. They could see Aizawa, standing a couple of feet away from them, amidst a sea of police officers, EMS, and paramedics. Their teacher was talking to someone on the phone, words rapidly being fired between him and whoever was on the other end of the line. Shinsu could see the moment he spotted them, as the man's eyes widened and his shoulders slumped in relief. The phone was still held to his ear, but now with another hand blocking the speaker, he marched towards them. "Are you guys okay? Are you injured?" he asked. his voice urgent and to the point. Mr. Aizawa. Todoroki began calmly, however, the man wanting immediate confirmation, and with the collar still on hold in his grip, he repeated the question again, an urgency in his voice they'd never heard before. Answer me, is any one of you injured? No, we're fine, but Mr. Aizawa's shadow, Yes, I know, he's here. If you're not injured, please head to the medical tents for a checkup anyway, and then go join your classmates. The man's eyes were trained on the woods behind them, as if he expected the vigilante to pop out of the foliage. No, Aizawa-sensei, you don't understand. The man was already back to his heated conversation on the phone, which now, up close, they could tell was with the police captain. Eraserhead. Shinsu's voice sounded harsh to his own ears, his tone carrying a heavy, serious tinge to it. It stopped the hero in his tracks, gray eyes immediately connecting with Shinsu's as he gave them his full attention. I'll call you back. The man spoke into the speaker, immediately hanging up the phone without bothering to wait for a response. Shadow's gone. Now that he could speak freely, he felt the words falter in his mind. Too weak to voice what he really wanted to say. Did you see him leave already? He could see the edge of something dark in the hero's eyes, a suspicion the man was trying to stifle down, despite his growing sense of dread. The League has him. The League of Villains took Izuku. Bakugo blurted, uncharacteristically desperate as he spoke. The phone fell to the ground, hitting the dirt with a soft thud. Forgotten as for the first time in so long, Aizawa's shadow felt real, crushing fear. The world tilted on its axis, twisting and morphing into something Izuku could not even begin to describe. His sense of distance and space vanished as the warp gate swallowed them whole. Disorientation and nausea, intense and overwhelming, hit him like a train. They couldn't have been in there for more than a second, but to Izuku's senses, it might as well have been an eternity. His feet hit solid ground, unsteady and shaking as he crashed to the floor instantly. His legs felt too weak to carry his weight. He didn't know where he was. The trip had muddled his senses, and it would take him a while to regain his bearings. Hands, rough and unforgiving, manhandled him until he was standing up, his weight resting against the villain only for a moment before he was unceremoniously dumped onto a metal chair. His arms were seized on either side of him. He could hear the click of manacles shackling him to either side of the chair. The metal bit into his skin painfully with the tightness of its hold. His head lolled to the side, his awareness slowly expanding until he could make out the area around him. They had taken him to the bar. He was in the League of Villains headquarters. Well, Shigaraki's voice, cold and dripping with smugness, reached his ears, coming from a place behind him. It seems our plans weren't wasted. I knew you'd show up, like the cockroach you are. Looks like you walked right into our trap, Shadow. What do you want, Shigaraki? His voice was steadier than he felt. His tone was low and serious as he addressed the man. His whole body ached. He felt tired and hurt. He just wanted to get this over with. For one, I think we'd all agree that we'd like to finally see the face behind the mask. The villain responded. Shadow could feel him turning to the rest of the villains gathered around them. Each one took up a different place in the bar. Any objections? No. They were all on the metaphorical edge of their seats. He could feel it in their postures. He could even sense Dabai's anticipation as the man fidgeted with the staples buried in his burnt skin. With slow, prolonged movements, the villain stretched lean, calloused fingers towards Izuku's head. The cloth crumbled to dust the moment 5 fingers made contact with it. He could feel the weight changing and falling away, ash coating his hair as it scattered over him. He didn't know if Shigaraki recognized him yet, with the mask still tied to his eyes, covering half of his face. He remembers his green hair being strangely distinctive. The villain didn't stop there, to Izuku's rising horror. With agonizingly slow movements, as if to stretch out the moment infinitely, Shigaraki lowered one finger at a time onto his mask. His heart threatened to break right out of his ribcage as the thin fabric dissolved under the man's touch. Rough fingers ghosting across his skin for a quarter of a second, a silent threat. A show of power. Silence, complete and encompassing, settled in the space between them, hanging in the air like a cloud. You. The villain hissed, anger dripping from his every word. It was you. All this time. A snarl left his lips as he reached for the closest object, a cup resting seamlessly on the counter, and smashed it against the wall behind Izuku's head. Stray shards exploded on impact. The sound rang in his ears, making him flinch involuntarily. You're the brat that ruined my quest at Kiyoshi Ward. I know him. Who is that? Twice, if he remembers correctly from his research, shouted in contradiction. His tone changed in between his two sentences. His scars are so pretty. Toga cooed, giggling, her face uncomfortably close. He could feel her stare, making his skin crawl. Look at his eyes. Why does he look like that? Did he hit his head or something? Spinner asked, oblivious to the dawning realization that fell on the rest of his comrades. He's blind, you idiot. Dabai reprimanded, his arms twisting until they were crossed over his chest. Ha! Twice burst out suddenly, his laughter startling some of the villains as he jumped, pointing a finger at Shigaraki. Pathetic. You kept losing to a blind kid man. So strong. Shut up. The villain hissed. His tone bore no space for jest. His anger was rising to precarious levels. This doesn't change anything. Would you like to proceed with the plan, Tamura? Kurajiri, who until now had been silently polishing a whiskey glass, spoke up. Yeah, let's do it. A crazed grin stretched across the man's features as he once again turned to face the vigilante. You'll like this plan, I think. He started ominously. You were the one that inspired me to do it after all. After that little stunt you pulled in Camino. Turning back to his comrades, he added, rough him up a little, then knock him out. Kurajiri, ready the van so we can move our little show elsewhere. Dread pooled in waves in his guts as he braced himself for what was in store for him. The dark aura radiating from the man didn't help to quell his worries. The hall bristled with motion, crowded and busy with activity as everyone rushed to work. Sakachi turned his attention back to the meeting at hand. His gaze was no longer drawn to the window overlooking the police station outside the conference room. The UA teachers were gathered around the table, along with the principal and Sakachi himself. We're wasting time as it is. There's no reason for us to do a press conference. Aizawa shouted, voice uncharacteristically loud as he protested. The principal, who until now has been eerily calm, just looks at him steadily. Midoriya may not be a UA student, but he is a UA ward. The public will want answers. Vlad can handle that. My attention is needed here, Netsu. I will not back down on this. His gray eyes spoke of honesty, leaving no space for argument. Very well, Aizawa-san, you can have it your way. The rodent relented. I understand you care for Midoriya-kun, however, you need to calm yourself. You will be of no help to him if you're panicking. Aizawa's eyes hardened, nodding his head once. He knew his behavior was irrational. It didn't stop his mind from coming up with the worst-case scenarios. He just hoped that Izuku was okay. Now, detective, have you got any leads on the League's location? Not anything conclusive. However, we've heard rumors the past few months about their suspected headquarters. A couple of officers are investigating it as we speak. Have you assembled a task force yet? All Might spoke, having stayed uncharacteristically silent until now. I've contacted both Best Jeanist and Endeavor. They both confirmed. However, given that the request was made using Shadow's alias as a hostage, some heroes were hesitant to cooperate. How many agreed? 5 full-fledged pro-heroes and 7 sidekicks. Similar expressions of frustration and indignation flitted across the teachers' faces. What kind of heroes disregard a child's kidnapping? Present Mike exclaimed in outrage, fist banging against the wooden surface with a resounding thud. Sakachi, who until now was doing his best not to lose his cool, only shook his head, knowing they couldn't waste any time discussing the matter. Shadow was in trouble. He'd be damned if he didn't do everything in his power to save him. It seems we'll have to work with the numbers we have. As if on cue, the moment he finished his sentence, the door burst open. A gust of wind accosted the room, a couple of papers flying with the momentum. There, panting with a hand scratching his neck bashfully, elbows still smoking, was Ingenium. "Count me in." At the surprised looks he received, he continued, voice solemn, sincere. "Look, Shadow saved my life. He's a hero in my book. He deserves to be saved. Welcome to the task force." Aizawa deadpanned, voice entirely serious. Consciousness came to him slowly. As if he was fighting against a raging current, wading through layer after layer of disorientation as he tried to focus back his senses. Something was covering his head, a bag of sorts. His head throbbed, a strong smell of copper emanated from a wound on his forehead. The crusting blood dripped sluggishly, coating the entire left side of his face, forcing him to close one of his eyes. His lips were stinging, having been split during the lengthy beating he got at the hands of the League. He doesn't know who participated, having been too busy trying to breathe at the time to decipher the different forms in his mind. His shoulders burned, his arms were shackled to the ceiling, figure hanging from the chain, his toes barely touching the ground. His entire body felt like one big bruise. An ache he could not pinpoint seemed to radiate throughout his limbs. The pain in his ribs, however, coupled with the sounds of creaking he could hear every time his chest expanded, spoke of a few cracked ribs. Taking in a deep breath and letting it out, he tried to magnify his senses, focus on his surroundings instead of what was happening in his own body. The first thing he noticed was the smell. A strong, over-encompassing smell of ash and burnt chemicals accosted him all at once. The room he was in was big. There were no apparent windows, leading him to believe he was being held underground. It took him a while, something he blamed on his addled senses. But sure enough, he recognized the place. He'd been here before, in fact. He was the one who burned it to the ground. It seems he missed the warehouse's basement in his haste to destroy it. The structure wasn't stable, he could tell by the vibrating of the walls alone. The support beams had been compromised in the fire. On closer inspection, Shadow could safely say they would give away at any moment. "Ah, look who's finally awake." Shigaraki cooed darkly, only now stepping into the room. "Right on time." "What are you planning, Shigaraki?" His voice was rough from disuse. The bag over his head was making it hard to breathe. "What are you going to do with me?" "Won't be fun if I tell you." The villain snarled, fiddling with something he could not decipher. A clicking sound echoed through the room, followed by a snapping noise. Focusing intensely, he could just barely make out the form of a camera. Shigaraki was setting it up on a stand. "You'll just have to find out with the rest of the world." "Where's the rest of your crew then? Don't you want them to be here for this?" He knew he was grasping at straws here, stalling. Yet he couldn't help but wonder where the rest of the League was. It was unusual to find Shigaraki without his ragtag team of misfits. "Shut up, brat. I won't be needing them for this." Shigaraki's impatience was evident. "They have other places to be at the moment." He muttered darkly, his smirk almost palpable. "Now, get ready for the show." The meeting had been going on for approximately 3 hours. They were almost ready to go through with the sting at the bar. The officers had come back with confirmation. Known members of the League had been sighted at the scene. The task force had been readied immediately. They were just waiting for the go-ahead. Ready to dispatch, Tsukachi's declaration was interrupted as an officer burst into the room, chest heaving as if he'd run through the whole precinct. "Detective, you need to see this. The League has a countdown on TV. They're going live in a few seconds." The room's temperature seemed to drop a few degrees, growing cold as the implications settled on the group. This couldn't mean anything good. Dread washed over Aizawa, worry gripping him like a vice as he watched the detective turn on his computer, connecting it to the screen at the front of the room. For everyone to see, the previously black screen lit up with a timer. The numbers dwindled slowly, ominously. It showed a growing number of viewers at the bottom. The whole country had to be watching this. They waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a big 0 was displayed in bold in the middle of the black screen. The live feed had started. Chapter 29. Who Lives, Who Dies. In the twilight, the fabric of the world felt muted in its hues, waiting patiently for the dawn. For it to ignite the earth in color for all to see. In the darkness that bathed his room, Shinsu felt as though the air moved like cool water. Sluggish and smooth, slowing down reality, as if time itself was frozen. A sanctuary from the rest of the world. The paper felt rough in his hand, wrinkled and stained with time. Nevertheless, his fingers ghosted against it reverently, holding it as if it was the most precious thing in existence. Slowly, leisurely, he deposited it into the drawer that lay open on the desk next to him. With one last longing look, he closed the drawer. The soft thud of the wood, the only sound that pierced the air, disrupting the silence that had settled like a blanket over him. Looking ahead at the body-length mirror positioned in front of him, his reflection stares back at him mockingly. The suit he was wearing felt stifling and constricting, despite its comfortable size. With quivering fingers, he picks up the black tie that was draped over the mirror's stand. His hands shake, fingers trembling relentlessly as he tries to gain some semblance of control over his limbs. Frustration coils inside of him, only serving to increase the unsteadiness he feels down to his core. He feels as though he were trapped in a dream, a nightmare, as if he's wading through thick layers of distorted reality. Despair and a deep, overwhelming sadness permeate the atmosphere around him. None of the layers stick to him, though. He's disconnected from the waking realm, watching through a thinly drawn veil as the world crumbles down around him. It feels wrong to be here. Unfair and devastating to be alive, when he was not. The quaking of his fingers increases, and he finds himself violently ripping the tie from his throat. The action knocks his elbow against the mirror. The structure wobbles but doesn't break. He finds himself wishing it had. Wishing he could watch it crack under the pressure, shattering into a million tiny pieces. Because then he wouldn't be the only broken thing residing in the room. With a swallowed sob, a cracking sound that barely escapes his throat, he falls to the ground, knees hitting the hardwood floor painfully. His hand snakes in his hair, digging into his scalp. The pain serves to ground him, an anchor of sorts, distracting him from the storm of emotion that brewed within him, because anything is better than this overwhelming sense of loss. An emptiness he feels contracting and expanding deep within his chest, into his very heart. Low light floods the room as a figure steps in. Without looking up, Shinsu already knows who it is. It doesn't stop him from flinching as tentative fingers slowly unravel his hands from their tight grip on his hair. Calloused fingers warm against his skin. Aizawa holds them with a gentleness he never expected from the man, as if the teen before him was made of delicate, fragile porcelain, at risk of breaking at any given moment. No words are exchanged between them. There is no need for it. Aizawa crouches in front of him, his hand coming up to wrap around him. Shinsu can do nothing but let the silent tears he's been holding back trickle down his face. He lets go, because soon he will have to pull himself up, glue the damaged pieces like a child's broken toy, stick them back together long enough to get through the day. In the dark, through bloodshot eyes, he lets his gaze settle on his teacher. The man looks like he's aged 10 years. Dark circles drill into his face, making him look incredibly exhausted, more so than usual. His eyes speak of the same sorrow that Shinsu feels scorching in his heart, ripping at the seams of his very being. Wordlessly, the man picks up the tie that now lay discarded on the floor. The process of wrapping it around Shinsu's neck is methodical, slow, and prolonged. They're both stalling, wanting to hold on to the moment before it slips away, before reality inevitably sets in. Straightening the collar of his dress shirt, the man swipes at invisible dust on his shoulder, nodding as if to convey a silent message. as if he was declaring Shinsu ready. His eyes were serious and heavy with meaning. He was telling him that he could get through this, that they both could, together. "It's time, isn't it?" he asks, voice small, as fragile as he felt in this moment. "It is." Aizawa's voice is rough, as if he's been screaming. They walk out of the room shoulder to shoulder. Despite the silent support, Shinsu has never felt more alone. 1 week prior, his wrists burn, the strain from his current position, pulling painfully on his joints. The bag over his head prevented him from breathing properly. The gag the villain had shoved into his mouth a few minutes ago served only to worsen his condition. His chest heaved with the effort to keep his body standing, trying his hardest to take some of the weight off his aching shoulders. The chains clinked and chimed with every micro-movement his body made, his senses working on overdrive as he tried to make sense of the world around him. Shigaraki had finished setting up his camera. However, instead of starting the recording, the man had wandered to another part of the room. A new villain had joined him a little while ago. One Izuku could not recognize despite his hardest attempt to place the man. The object they were fiddling with was completely obscured to Izuku's senses. No electric current circulated within it. No obvious shape adorned it. It was an unknown, and Izuku didn't like it, not one bit. "Are you sure the second one is ready?" Izuku was grateful for the villain's ignorance of his powers. His senses could easily pick up on their conversation. "It's ready? You just have to go through with it." The newcomer left shortly after, only letting out a grunt in acknowledgement before disappearing out of the building altogether. "Now that that's done, we can begin," Shigaraki announced sardonically, picking up the camera off its stand and bringing it closer to his face. His position obscured Shadow's form. For now, the only thing visible to the camera was the villain himself, in close-up. Fiddling momentarily with the computer plopped next to the camera, he pressed the recording button. The students of Class 1A are all gathered in the hospital waiting room when it begins. At least, the ones that are not currently being treated, or are still unconscious since they were brought here after the attack at the camp. The silence rests heavily in the air around them. Todoroki can see it weighing heavily on everyone. Everyone is moving, pacing or fidgeting. Moving but not talking or interacting. As if every one of them is lost in their own world, trapped by their thoughts. Todoroki himself can't help but replay every interaction he's ever had with Midoriya, over and over in his mind. He remembers wondering what he could have done, even as the warp gate closed behind the boy. Uraraka walks back and forth to the doors, separating them from the emergency care unit. As if her movements will somehow summon the doctors and simultaneously bring good news. On either side of him sit Shinsu and Bakugo. Both haven't uttered a word since they got here. Shinsu keeps checking his phone every few minutes. His disappointment rises with each empty lock screen he faces. Todoroki can see it, in the slump of his shoulders, the tapping of his foot. It's the only sound that penetrates the silence. It only serves to amplify everyone's nerves, making them excruciatingly aware of the slow passing of time. Kirishima and Ida are the only ones who were not completely catatonic, amidst their small cluster of friends. Both for very different reasons. However, Todoroki was certain that if it weren't for Ida's position as class president, the boy would surely be visibly panicking by now. The teen hides his anxiety well, choosing to channel it instead by asking every passing nurse multiple thoroughly thought-out questions about the injured students. Kirishima is the only one who looks remotely hopeful. He's been like this ever since Yayurazu told him she planted a tracker on one of the villains, the one with the magnets, in particular. The class hadn't agreed with his plan to go out and search for Midoriya on their own. It had created a sort of rift between them and the rest of the class. Unsurprisingly, Ida and Uraraka had immediately agreed to help. Both of them felt they owed the vigilante. Not to mention the friendship they had cultivated with the teen in the short time they had known him. Shinsu didn't even have to answer. The boy had been planning his own search and rescue operation, even before they had any kind of lead on Midoriya's location. Bakugo, for his part, had to be physically restrained before he agreed to wait. The boy was all but ready to go out there, hands blazing. Todoroki himself wanted to save his friend, even if it meant doing something potentially illegal and destroying whatever trust they had garnered with their teachers and their school. He's never had any friends before this year. He learned to cherish the few people he cared for. Midoriya, in the limited time he has spent with the teen, had managed to break through most of his defenses and find himself a spot on that short list. Breaking out of his momentary contemplation, his attention is drawn to a nurse. The women enter the room in a hurry, hand clutching a remote. He watches, curious, as she aims the object at the TV hanging on the wall on the far side of the room. The dark display lights up with life. A news anchor could be seen talking on camera. Breaking news, a nationwide broadcast of the villain organization who call themselves the League of Villains is about to be shown live. Internet analysts predict this to be one of the most widely viewed internet events in Japan history. What the hell? Bakigu's voice was low as he spoke, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. The rest of the class wore a similar expression as they straightened in their seats. The room seemed to drop a couple of degrees in temperature as the anticipation and dread rose in the air. Turn up the volume. When the nurse made no move to do so, Shinsu repeated the blonde's request. Voice harsher as his anxiety increased. They watched with bated breath as a countdown started and painstakingly dwindled to nothing. The numbers displayed 10 seconds only, however, to them. It felt like an entire eternity later that the feed finally began. Shigaraki was holding the video camera close to his face. He was decked out in full costume, down to the disembodied hands attached to his face and body, covering his eyes and most of his features. The only thing visible was his maniac grin. His voice was sharp and jeering as he spoke. The red sheen of his eyes seemed to glow within the shadows cast by the appendage. Greetings, citizens of Japan. The villain introduced himself, boasting about the havoc and chaos he's been creating this past year. But we're not here to talk about that. No, tonight I have a special guest. This shadow you've been hearing whispers about, the one mysteriously saving people these past few years. Well, you're finally going to see the man behind the mask. The villain moved the camera back to its place on the stand. The lens was momentarily blocked by the villain's body as the man reached for something off-screen. His breath caught in his throat when Shigaraki moved away. From the corner of his eye, he could see Shinsu's hand tighten, its grip on the chair he was sitting on. Knuckles white with the pressure. There, beaten and bloodied, hanging from shackles chaining his wrists to the ceiling, was Shadow. His costume, despite the numerous tears in it, was easily recognizable. His face was covered by a black bag, however. What little skin was visible was covered in molten blue and purple bruises, covering his skin like paint on a canvas. It made his blood boil, looking at the state of his friend. He's never felt more helpless, more useless. All they could do was watch as the villain approached the boy, a crutch now visible in his hands. The familiar crimson red of Midoriya's walking stick contrasted greatly with the gray and black grime that seemed to cover the surfaces of the walls around them. However, the lighting of the room made it impossible to discern its content, nor any other useful identifying element. It made the frustration bubble up inside of him, like boiling water on a hot stove, threatening to spill to the surface. He's never had any difficulty holding back his emotions. It seemed Midoriya was, once again, the exception to the rule. You see, this vigilante you're all so proud of, the one the heroes have been trying so damn hard to catch, the one the villains have been cowering and fearing for years, is nothing but a pathetic, blind kid. The man spits the words, his voice dripping with venom as his hand came down to clutch at the bag, covering Izuku's face from the world. The fabric, like the hood of his costume, disintegrated in the flurry of ash, draping the floor with another layer of dust, adding to the filth. Shigaraki grinned maliciously, 4 fingers digging into the boy's scalp, forcing his head back, exposing his face to the camera, to the world. Shadow's mouth was gagged, preventing him from uttering a single word. Blood oozed from a wound on his forehead methodically. His face, to their horror, mirrored the state of his body in its bruises. They could see the panic and pain he was trying so hard to hide. However, the thing that seemed to draw the most attention was his eyes. His pale, milky green eyes seemed to pierce them right through the screen, as if he was looking right at them, into their very souls. His gaze was unfocused, filled to the brim with both resignation and frustration. "Never meet your heroes, kids," the villain snarled darkly, letting go of Shadow's head abruptly, surely pulling a couple of strands of hair in the process. "They just tend to be so disappointing," the man continued, oblivious to the chaos he was wreaking, the distress he was causing to the people witnessing his actions. "I have a lot of things planned, but first," the villain twisted the walking stick in his grip, spinning the metal crutch through the air. "I'm going to show you why you should never play at being heroes." The sound of the rod hitting flesh resounded through the waiting room. The hit came swiftly and brutally. The villain had struck the teen right in the face, his head turning with the momentum and power behind the hit. He could hear the sharp intake of breath coming from Uraraka as Shigaraki struck again, this time hammering the boy right in the stomach. Midoriya's pained breath seemed to play on a loop in his mind. His wheezing, heaving breath made his heart ache. Isn't it nice to be on the receiving end? With one last hit, this time catching the teen in his side, the chains rattling as the vigilante's body was pushed by the force. They could see the mounting anger in the vigilante's eyes. Straightening up from his fighting stance, the villain faced back the recording device, gaze dark and serious as he threw the stick to the ground, already bored with it. "Now that that's over with, we can get to the interesting part." His tone promised nothing good as he procured a remote from his pants pocket. He could already feel his heart drop as realization slowly started to dawn on him. Looking at his friends, he could see it in their eyes, the implication dropping on them like cold water, washing over them in waves. The moment his finger connected with the big red button adorning the object, a monitor lit up above the chalked teen. On the pixelated screen, in big red lettering, was another countdown. He regretted it now, his earlier wish for the numbers to dwindle faster. There, displayed for the world to see, was the mark for 60 minutes. The numbers, like the fate of the boy chained under them, were already running their course. Chapter 30, Shattered. The air felt so brittle with tension, it could snap. And if it doesn't, he would. His hands clench and unclench in his lap, fingers rubbing at his wrist in an anxious habit he has yet to break. Sweat was gathering in his palms. The smell of caramel and nitroglycerine probably surrounded him like a thick cloud. He couldn't get himself to care. He wanted to let go, let fire ignite on his skin, explode the world all to hell. Maybe then he would feel something. Maybe then he would feel like himself again. Bakugo always hated funerals, hated the platitudes and well wishes. He looks around him, and all he sees are strangers. Civilians from all over the country had come, intent on showing respect to the fallen vigilante, a hero in all but legality. There's a soul candle held tightly in their individual grasp, lit in silent vigil and respect. He could recognize a few faces. The detective from the USJ and the mall incident, the owner of the store he kept visiting for a while, if only to get a glimpse of the boy he had lost all those years ago, and lost again now. Ingenium's expression stands out to him. His features are contorted with something painfully familiar. He's seen it many times in the mirror, after all. The grief, the guilt, the pain. The hero is huddled next to the detective and another man. The stranger is wearing a white coat. He doesn't look like any hero Katsuki has seen before. The trio stand there, solemn and silent, as they watch the service unfold. A lot of pro-heroes were amongst the present too, all gathering to witness the award ceremony. The nerd would have loved it, he was sure. Would have probably demanded autographs from each and every one of them. Bakugo wanted to take the award and destroy it. Because that Medal of Honor and Valor, a hero's award of the highest caliber, shouldn't be buried within the earth. It shouldn't be lost to the ground. It should have been given to the owner in life. The boy should have been here to accept it, would have worn it proudly as he proved to the world that he could be a hero, that he was a hero. Yet, here he stood, watching through red-rimmed eyes and clenched teeth as the captain of the police department presented the medal to a ghost. A boy who was no longer among them. Lost to the world, a sacrifice. A hero. The man spoke of the teen's accomplishments, the lives he saved and changed and moved in the short life he led. He spoke of his death, expressing the country's pride and their eternal gratitude. Of his sacrifice and his courage. It made him want to scream, rage at the man, at the world in its entirety. Because how dare they do this now? Why couldn't they realize all that when there was a hero to celebrate? When there was a person to appreciate the glory, the honor? Was he allowed to imagine this? Imagine all the things the teen would have done and lived through if he was still here. Still alive. He wonders how many dreams were washed away that night, under the rain. Wonders if the boy ever imagined a future for himself, when it was always destined to expire early. How many things had he imagined and dreamed? Things that would never see the light of day. Tears welled in his eyes, anger and frustration, only just overshadowed by the devastating sense of grief that threatened to bury him along with the casket before him. The captain continued his speech, unaware of the storm that threatened to rip him at the seams, tearing him apart from the inside out. Because what right did they have to be here, when he wasn't? When he would never get to be? Kirishima, who was silently crying next to him, snaked a hand into his own. Fingers warm against his calloused palm. The gesture didn't make the anger go away, didn't make him feel any less of a useless bastard. The rest of the class wasn't faring much better. Aizawa could see it in the way they huddled together, silent in their mourning. Not any less devastated for it. His eyes burned, unshed tears desperately wanting to escape as he watched the captain lay 2 medals on the closed casket before them. The small, wooden box was drowning in flowers and offerings. Small because it was meant for a child. A child they were currently burying beneath the earth. A boy he'd sworn he'd protect. Knuckles clenching, nails digging into calloused flesh, he listened with rapt attention as the captain gave his speech. Because that was what the boy deserved. Every ounce of respect, acknowledgement, and the gratitude he would, alas, never get. Because he wasn't there to appreciate it, and that thought alone almost brought Shouta to his knees. A hand squeezed his arm, and he turned, gaze meeting Shinsu's incredibly sad eyes. Eyes that were looking at him with a deep, painful level of understanding he never wanted to see in one of his students. Yet, he'd seen it in all of his students that day. And he knew, at the back of his mind, that he'd continue to see it henceforth. For they would never completely move on from this, not really. And he didn't think he wanted them to. 1 week prior, Izuku's chest heaved as he tried to regain his bearings. His head was foggy. The hit he took only served to amplify the headache he already felt drilling into his skull. It's ironic, really, that the villain would use his own weapon against him. His side throbbed at the mere memory. Distantly, Izuku wondered just how many people were watching the live feed. Wondered if his last months would be spent rotting in jail. Would they arrest him, now that the world knew who he was? His spiraling thoughts were cut off as Shigaraki procured a small object from his pocket. Dread, heavy and hot, pooled in his stomach anew as the villain pressed the button adorning the device. Immediately, a whirring sound filled his ears, as if a mechanism had been triggered. Closing his eyes, he focused his senses, instantly finding the source. The object was bulky. Wires and cables decorated it like vines, twisting and winding into its fold. Energy seemed to circulate within it, burning hot and sluggish as it spread through the wires and into its core. It felt wrong to his senses. The energy was unlike the usual electricity and power he perceived within the walls and buildings. It could only be described as alive and unstable. Like a volcano bubbling and boiling, buzzing with life, a beehive in constant motion, at risk of erupting at any moment. The reality of the situation washed over him, like icy water drawn from a frozen lake. It felt as if he was standing on the ice right now, watching helpless as the ground beneath his feet cracked and crumbled. As he was pulled into the murky, icy depth, Shigaraki's next words only served to confirm his theory. The villain had planted a bomb in the warehouse. In 1 hour, the place would explode, taking Izuku out with it. Suddenly, the interaction between the two villains made a lot more sense. It also made the situation a lot worse. You have 1 hour. Shigaraki was saying. The smirk on his features was almost palpable. Enjoy the show. He finished darkly, already turning to leave the condemned building. However, before he walked away, the villain turned one last time towards the chained vigilante. Leaning uncomfortably close, his voice low enough not to be picked up by the microphone. It seems your story ends here, Shadow. His voice was tinged with dark amusement as he spoke. Everyone will be looking for you now. They won't even suspect the real reason behind this little display. With that, the man walked out, not giving the vigilante another glance. The camera kept rolling, even as Izuku focused his senses, stretching out his reach beyond anything he's ever attempted before. His breathing picked up as he exerted himself, voices and noise flooding his mind like a broken radio. The sounds were excruciating, overwhelming in every sense of the word. However, just as he was about to break under the onslaught, he found it. The second bomb's signature was strong, thick, and sluggish to his senses, hidden inside a metal container. The lack of life, followed by the flow of a reeking liquid, made it obvious it was located in the sewers. Spreading his attention around the area itself, he blocked out all the unwanted information he was getting. It seems luck was on his side for once, as the robotic voice of an underground train station announced the area's name. Gasping a heaving breath, it felt like he'd run a marathon. Sweat gathered on his forehead, lungs constricting as he concentrated back on the world around him. The darkness in his vision felt even emptier now, as he let go of his hold on his powers. Too tired to make use of the information his mind was presenting him, he needed to warn them. He needed to find a way to get the information across. Chaos, absolute chaos, reaped the precinct as its occupants scrambles to find the bomb's location. The task force for the villain bar breakdown already moved out. All Might and Endeavor were leading the group. Aizawa, Sakachi, Nedzu, and Ingenium had stayed behind, intent on keeping an eye on the live feed. Their decision proved wise when the bomb's existence was announced to the world. Officers bustled around him, each one tasked with a specific and valuable task. As they rushed around, a metaphorical hourglass seemed to loom over them like a shadow. They were fighting a losing battle against the clock. Inevitably, they would run out of time. Aizawa sat there, feeling like he was standing in the eye of the storm. The world moved and hurried around him, making it feel as though he was the only one remaining still. Still and completely useless. They didn't have Izuku's location, the boy's life was at risk, and they could do nothing but hope they'd get to him in time. The live feed was still running, the camera still rolling, even as Shigaraki left the building, leaving the shackled vigilante to his fate. Breathing through his nose, he tried to calm his nerves. The principal had been right. Panicking now would serve no purpose. What's the status on the live feed? Did you find a way to cut the public's access to it? He heard Nedzu ask Tsukachi. We need to find a way to prevent any further panic. My tech guys are on it. Putting a hand to his earpiece, the detective held up a finger. It should be done in. Trailing off and looking at his watch, the man continued. Now, we are officially the only ones watching it. He didn't turn to look at them. His eyes remained trained on the video displayed on the screen in front of him. Midoriya's eyes were closed, a pained expression on his features, seemingly concentrating deeply on something. His hands clenched in frustration, fingers twitching with the need to do something, anything to help. He's never been one to sit still and do nothing while someone he cared about was in trouble. He'd sworn he would protect Izuku. He'd sworn he'd save Shadow. And here he was, failing him twice over. Izuku's eyes were open now, a troubled look morphing his face. He watched, with rapt attention, as the teen straightened, his feet gaining enough balance to stand on his own weight, his toes just barely reaching the ground. Something had changed in his demeanor. The hero could feel it. Something was different still. Aizawa couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Did you see that?" The words left his mouth before he could think better of it, already getting up to move closer to the screen. "What?" Sakachi, riffling through a stack of papers, barely sparing the hero a second glance as he focused on his task. The folders he was going through were a collection of eyewitness accounts, all in relation to the League of Villains. It made it incredibly easy to get lost within them. "That," the man repeated, voice louder, urgent, as he pointed at the boy on the screen. Right there, his fingers. Nedzu, who had been just as engrossed in a pile of files, looked at the video, eyes widening in dawning realization. "Oh, you brilliant boy," the principal whispered, low enough for only Aizawa to hear. The teacher, standing the closest to the rodent. "He's using Morse code. He's sending us a message." Tensei, who had been going through multiple news articles online, spoke up, walking up to stand next to the underground hero. "Quick, someone write it down." They all collectively looked back at the live feed, focus zeroing on the rhythmic tapping of the boy's finger against the chain shackling him to the ceiling. He was repeating the same pattern over and over. Huffing as no one immediately moved, Aizawa hurriedly snatched a paper off of the ever-growing pile on the conference table. 2 taps in quick succession, followed by 3 harder, slightly drawn-out taps. He's repeating the number 2. Ignoring his rising confusion, he focused on the second part of the pattern. 1 long knock, followed by 3 rapid taps, and so on. "BOM," his voice trailed off, cold, heavy realization washing over him. That can't be right. Looking back at the screen, the rhythm remained the same. His translation wasn't wrong. "There's another bomb." His statement met heavy silence as each took a moment to assimilate the newfound information. It felt as though a rock had lodged itself in his chest, grinding on his lungs and restricting his breath. The situation just kept getting worse. "Look," the rhythm changed. Tensei pointed out after a moment, drawing attention to the boy's new pattern. "Hasu." He's spelling Hasu. And of course, Nedzu would be able to translate Morse code without having to write it down first. "Do you think that's where they're keeping him?" Aizawa dares to hope, if only for a second. Knowing Shadow, he'd worry more about others than himself. Sakachi ran a hand through his disheveled hair, tousling them even more. "It's probably the location of the second bomb. I'll call for a full-scale evacuation. We'll need to find its exact location, though." "I'm on it. I can get there faster than anyone. I'll call you when I find something." Turning to the principal, he added, "You can help me defuse it if I show you what model it is, right?" "Of course." The rodent replied simply, critically, as if it was normal for someone to possess casual knowledge on how to defuse a bomb. With that affirmation, the speed hero zoomed out of the room. The gust of wind in his wake disrupted the files on the table, sending several papers flying. "Look," he stopped. Gaze jumping back to the recording, Aizawa gaped at the new scene before him. "What is he doing?" Sakachi asked, voice showing his confusion. Midoriya had indeed stopped transmitting the code, probably frustrated with the uncertainty. Aizawa couldn't imagine being in his place, having the knowledge of an incoming threat and being unable to know if the warning had been headed. The vigilante's fingers were flexing against the chains, as if testing his grip on them. His legs began to swing back and forth, unhurried and steady at first, as if swaying in place. However, ever so slowly, methodically, his momentum picked up, his speed increasing as his body moved with the swing. Faster and swifter than any seasoned pro hero could have executed, the boy's legs latched onto the chain above him. His body turned with the motion until he was hanging upside down, legs and arms latching onto the chains holding him up, with a strength he wouldn't have expected from a teenager of his size. Shadow pulled on the shackles, hauling his entire body up, one tug at a time as he scaled the chains until he reached the top. His body was mostly obscured by the darkness permeating the room. However, to Aizawa's trained eye, the boy's intentions were clear as day. He's escaping. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the boy took a moment as if to brace himself, contemplating the fragile, ruined support beams holding up the ceiling above him. Specifically, the metal beam that connected to the chains holding him up. With one last audible intake of breath, the vigilante let go. His body plummeted to the ground, back first as the length of the chain dropped down. The weight of his body coupled with the already fraying integrity of the beams made for an easy break. The metal cracked and caved under the weight, descending with him, effectively freeing him. His back hits the ground hard, bones rattling from the force as his breath gets physically knocked out of him. Aizawa winced as he hears the choked moan that escapes the boy as he lies there, chest heaving with the effort to regain his breathing. Pained groans escaped his lips as he arched his back, still shackled hands wrapping around his, no doubly, aching ribs. Relief, intense and overcoming, filled him to the brim. Midoriya was free. He could get out of there. Run. He whispered under his breath, eyes boring into the screen in a pathetic attempt to reach the boy. As if he stared hard enough, the boy would somehow miraculously hear him. Come on, kid. Get out of there. However, instead of getting up and running like Aizawa expected him to, like any other sane person would in this situation, the boy just took a moment to regain his bearings, intent on gaining control of his throbbing limbs and his hazy mind. He then proceeded to calmly straighten up and fiddle with his bootstrap. Why isn't he running out of there? Sakachi cried out, frustration and worry tinged in his tone. I believe he's looking for something, the principal stated, sounding like he was contemplating a thought. His eyes shined with something unsettling. They watched as the boy took off his left boot and turned it upside down, shaking it until an object dropped out. Oh hells, a phone. The leagues didn't search him. It is likely they underestimated him. Didn't think he'd be able to use his hands at all. He's calling someone. As if on cue, Aizawa's phone rang, lighting up with life as it buzzed, vibrating on the conference table. Chapter 31. Hope. His instincts were telling him to run, to hightail it out of there and never look back. The soft ticking of the timer somewhere above him felt like an ominous warning, slowly marking the rapidly diminishing time. His sense of duty and morality disagreed wholly with his instincts. The doubt, however, was fleeting in his mind as he laid there, listening to his own breathing, distantly, as if by a vague, detached thought running through his head. He realized that he'd already made his decision. Stifling the urge to flee, to take cover and hide, he stayed, ripping the gag from his mouth. Finally free of the uncomfortable, disgusting taste of dirt and grime, he took a moment to think. The villain had stripped him of his weapons, but they hadn't searched him completely. Therefore, in the hope that his hunch was correct, he began the process of unbuckling the straps of his boot. Elation washed over him as the phone he had stashed there dropped to the ground, hitting the concrete with a soft thud. On habit alone, he pressed the first contact on the device. The call ringed only for a moment before it was answered, as if the man had scrambled to answer it as soon as the call went through. Shadow, is that you? The hero's voice was breathy, relief evident in his tone. You have to get out of there, do you hear me? Taking a moment to exhale, steeling himself for the decision and the inevitable argument it would ensue, he spoke. We both know that's not going to happen, Eraser. His voice is soft yet steady, wanting the man to understand just how serious he was about this. I'm the only one close enough to stop this. We're wasting time as it is. And before the man could object, he plowed on. I need you to send someone to Hasu. Ingenium is already there. He's searching for the bomb as we speak. So they did get his message good. Tell him it's underground, probably in the sewage system. he informed quietly. I can feel them, Eraser. The energy thrumming through them is colossal. They will level the city. Then get the hell out of there, kid, please. We can send professionals. You don't have to do this. Behind the underground hero, Tsukachi had already notified Ingenium and was now busy trying to locate the call through satellite. A couple of minutes, and they'd have Midoriya's location. You can try and find me, but you won't get there in time. He didn't need his sight to know the timer above him was ticking. Time was running out. You know I'm right, Aizawa. And he added, as reassurance more than anything else. And don't worry, I know for a fact that my area has been evacuated. There are no civilians nearby. How could you possibly know that? I can sense it. That accident didn't just take away my sight, Eraserhead. And wasn't that a cruel reminder? Aizawa knew better than anyone just what the kid had lost that night. Midoriya, please, just get out of there, kid. You've already done enough. Even as he spoke, the tone in his voice gave away his resignation. He knew that no matter what, the kid wasn't going to run away from this. It was just not in his nature. A monitor beeped in the conference room, clear as day to Izuku's ears, even through the phone. I found it. I found the bomb. Static erupted from the device, indicating the lack of proper signal. Shadow was right. It's in the sewers. And a moment later, I sent you a picture. Oh my, the principal, even in crises, didn't lose the cadence in his voice as he spoke. This will be quite tricky. Turning to the underground hero, the rodent's voice lowered, indicating the severity of the situation. You're not going to like this, I'm afraid. Before Aizawa could even voice his worry, the principal approached the phone, currently laying on the table's surface on speaker. We will need your help for this, Midoriya. Aizawa's pulse thundered as he raced through the streets, blowing past multiple red lights as he fought against the clock. He had bolted out the door the moment the satellites zeroed in on Izuku's phone location. The logical part of his brain told him it was useless. Midoriya was right in saying they wouldn't get there in time. Yet, here he was, trying anyway. Because he knew he'd never be able to live with himself, knowing he hadn't tried everything before giving up. Izuku was just a child. He wasn't meant to be going through any of this. The team was currently trying to defuse a bomb, and Shadow would do anything to get there in time, to prevent the boy from facing this alone. In fact, he planned on getting Shadow and getting out of there as fast as possible. The roads were packed. The evacuation process had been immediately started the moment the bomb was located. Izuku was right when he said his area was clear. Still, they weren't taking any chances. A city-wide evacuation was being issued. However, turning on the radio, he could hear the news reporting the all-out battle that was currently happening just a few blocks away. Instead of finding where Midoriya was being kept, the task force had run into the League's headquarters, which in itself would have been good news if it weren't for their current predicament. Endeavor and several other heroes had already been incapacitated. All Might was facing the League's real leader, the man behind it all. His talents would surely be needed. However, Midoriya was his priority. He just had to believe that the number one could handle this alone. The GPS device beeped, signaling he was approaching the location. Maybe, if luck was on his side, he would get there in time. Okay, run me through the plan again. He combs a hand through his hair, fingers twitching with the effort to quell the shaking of his body. From both the video feed in your location and the pictures we got from Ingenium, it is safe to say that we will need to defuse both bombs at the exact moment. Any error in timing will result in the immediate detonation of the explosives. Nedzu replied calmly, having expected Shadow to be nervous. It didn't stop him from being painfully blunt in his response. The situation was grave. He treated it so. Cool, okay, Izuku spoke quietly, as if to himself. And are you sure the wire I'm touching right now is the red one? Despite his greatest effort, he failed to hide the tremor in his voice. They had spent the last 10 minutes making sure the wire he was about to cut was the correct one. He had moved the camera until they got a closer look at the bomb. They were his eyes right now. His fate was in their hands. Letting his senses wash over the room, he could feel it, the energy thrumming slightly stronger in the wire in question. It served to placate his doubts, if only slightly. Yes, now, gentlemen, time is running out. The rodent began. If you would please position your knives. Or in Izuku's case, the sharp piece of shrapnel he found lying around. Anticipation thrummed through his veins like a violin. Every nerve in his body felt electrified as he brought his hand closer and closer to his intended target. Sweat gathered on his brow with his rising anxiety. Were the walls closing in? It certainly felt like it. Breathe, midoriya. Tsukachi's voice felt like a bucket of cold water running down his back. It anchored him to the world before he could get lost in his doubts, subduing the storm that raged just behind his eyelids. The interruption made him pause just long enough to exhale, releasing some of the tension that had built up inside of him. Okay, I'm ready, he said slowly, despite feeling the complete opposite. A similar confirmation was heard from Tensei on the other line. Izuku envied the man for the steadiness of his voice. On 3. 1. They were really doing this. The piece of metal stung his finger as he applied more pressure to his grip. 2. He could hear the scrape of the cable on the sharp surface of his makeshift blade. To the normal person, it would be imperceptible. To his ears, it was everything. 3. His heartbeat skyrocketed as they made the cuts. The timer above him beeped, and finally it stopped. Nothing. A deafening silence settled over the room and through the call. They were all holding their breath. He could feel it. We did it. Tensei's voice sounded faint and distant. It didn't make the unfiltered joy disappear from his tone. He could hear Tsukachi laughing and Nedzu exhaling. Izuku did not share in their celebration. Dread pooled in waves through his guts. His heart dropped as a new sound settled behind him. The timer above him had stopped. Yet a new one had started. A third object that had previously been inactive, and therefore invisible to his senses, jumped to life. Midoriya, is something wrong? Tsukachi's worried voice barely registered in his mind as reality crashed down on him. The man could probably see the terror set in as Izuku raised his head to face the camera. There was a third bomb, probably set to activate as a fail-safe in case the other two were defused. I'm sorry, he whispered, trying his best to muster a last smile, eyes shining with sadness. And then the world burned. We're lost, just fucking admit it, Bakigu's gruff voice accused, his anger barely hiding the worry they were all feeling. We're not, we're close, I just know it. You saw the hero team, they were led just a few blocks away from here. If they got it wrong, then maybe our hunch is right. Kirishima defended, not breaking his stride as they marched across the street. The live feed had been shut down before the timer went off. For all they knew, time had already run out. You mean the hunch we got based on the Shinsu's unreliable information? He said Izuku mentioned that warehouse once. Why would they take him to a place that's already been burned down? Look, it's the only lead we got, okay? Can you please shut up so we can stop wasting time? Shinsu growled, turning away from the road to look at the explosive blonde. His momentary lack of awareness proved almost fatal as a car sped towards them, skidding abruptly to a stop, wheels screeching as the owner punched the brakes, just barely managing to stop the vehicle before it hit the teen. Pay attention, eyebags. We don't have the time to save your ass now. Ignoring the angry blonde, Shinsu kept his gaze trained on the car as the owner got out, dark eyes glaring at them with vigor. Familiar dark eyes. What the hell are you doing here? Their teacher screamed, fury radiating from him in waves. Never mind, I don't have time for this. Just as he finished his sentence, an explosion erupted behind them, shaking the very earth beneath their feet. For a moment, fire seared into the sky, as if reaching for the stars above, making way to dark smoke that soared into the atmosphere ominously. Glass shattered and sprayed outwards. creating an upsurge of projectiles and shrapnel covering the streets. The warehouse seemed to cave in on itself. The structure, already unstable, crumbled like a deck of cards. It all happened in a fraction of a second. Aizawa could feel the heat almost searing into his skin. The shockwaves came abruptly, pushing them bodily onto the ground as they scrambled for cover. From his crouched position near the car, he could see it, through wide, horror-filled eyes, the warehouse. Or at least, what was left of it. Fire and smoke rose in the air like a morose beacon. The flames were scattered and far between the rubble that now littered the space. It felt as if he'd been through this before. He could see it as if he was still there, that night, all those years ago. He had stood like he is today, watching the fire burn, consuming within it someone he was supposed to protect. Despair, heavy and overwhelming, loomed over him, akin to the smoke bellowing before him, threatening to suffocate him completely. The teenagers next to him were already on their feet, shouting as they ran, frantic in their pace and movements towards the carnage. It was only then that he snapped back into himself. This was not the time to panic. He could almost hear the principal's words echoing in his mind. Only one thought permeated the rest, though. A naive, illogical hope. He couldn't help but hold on to it. Because now, for as long as he could, he would latch on to it. The ability to hope. To deny reality. Stop. You'll get stuck if you go in there. Uraraka shouted at Kirishima's and Bakugu's backs, desperate fear tinging her voice. Shinsu stood frozen next to her. His gaze looked devoid of any emotion as he watched the wreckage. He took a step forward as if on autopilot, his body moving without active thought. Drawn like a moth to the flames. "Shinsu?" Todoroki asked, his quiet tone almost drowned out by the noise around them. His words seemed to trigger something deep within the male. His slow movements ceased as he took off, sprinting into the ruins. "Get away from there." Aizawa's voice rang as he followed behind his students. "It's dangerous." The teen gave no indication that he heard. Practically launching himself into the sea of rubble, hands already working to dislodge the rocks in his way. "Stop. You're going to hurt yourselves," the class president shouted, hand coming up to stop Uraraka as she tried to join the others in their frantic search. "We can help, Ida." The girl answered simply, determination outweighing her worry and fear. With that, they all got to work. Their training kicked in as they functioned in tandem. Kirishima protected them from any oncoming rubble, while Uraraka floated the bigger boulders in their way, depositing them a short distance away. Meanwhile, Todoroki and Yaoyorozu worked on stabilizing the structure, either with ice in the right places or actual bracers on weak points. Their movements were methodical, yet hurried. Shinsu and Bakugu were the only ones moving with no particular order, agitated and hysterical as they dug through the rubble. A constant stream of izuku could be heard spilling from Shinsu's mouth. His voice cracked with something almost fragile. Around them, the smoke and fire raged, mirroring their inner turmoil as they dug into the very ground to get to their friend. 1 week later, his warning allowed us to stop 2 of the bombs in time. However, the villains had used a quirk to trigger a 3rd detonation. His sacrifice that day saved so many lives. "This city will forever be in his debt," the captain was saying. His voice sounded far away, distant and hazy. "Excuse me?" a gruff voice called behind him. Turning to look at the newcomer, Aizawa could see the man was old. The scars around his eyes spoke of a terrible story. The walking stick held in his arms revealed the outcome. A couple stood behind him, a woman and a man. They were holding hands, staring sadly at the podium in front of them. "Are you Aizawa Shouda?" Yes. Aizawa didn't feel like talking to anyone. However, a smaller part of him was curious about how these people knew his kid. "I was told you were Izuku's guardian before." His words died down before they could make it out of his throat, looking incredibly older now as he spoke. Sensing his distress, the woman behind him stepped forward, resting a hand on the man's shoulder in silent support. I just wanted to thank you for giving him what I never got the chance to. You were the one who trained him, weren't you? Shinsu, who Aizawa hadn't noticed approaching, spoke up. His words were breathy as he realized just who it was, standing before them. You're Ryu. The man's hands clenched tightly around his walking stick, almost trembling with the tightness. Yes, I trained him, Ryu admitted quietly, guilt almost palpable. Maybe if I hadn't he would still be. Izuku loved you. He told me how without you, he would have probably given up on life a long time ago. So don't you dare regret it now. You were the reason he got to live out his dream. You gave him something to live for. The boy's voice cracked, a few tears escaping captivity without his consent. Aizawa wanted to hate the man. However, Shinsu's word rang true. Without this man, Shadow would have never become who he was. I think Izuku wouldn't want you to blame yourself. The hero's eyes were grave as conveyed the words. A memory rose to the surface of his mind. A cold night on a rooftop, heart-wrenching words, but above all, forgiveness. The significance only now sank in as he realized just what Shadow meant that day. With a solemn nod, the family turned to leave, the man only pausing once to ask one last thing. His tone was fragile, almost delicate as he spoke. Was he happy towards the end? Ignoring the aching threatening to crush his heart, he replied. I'd like to believe he was. 1 week earlier, hope was a dangerous thing to trifle with. Still, it didn't stop them from yearning for it. Over here, I think I found something. Chapter 32. As my heart gives out. The world tilted and morphed yet never settled. His head ached, his skull throbbing as he tried to tune back into his surroundings. Dust and dirt caked the air around him, making it incredibly hard to breathe. Something heavy weighed down on his chest. The crushing pressure made it impossible for his chest to expand. He tried to move. The action only brought intense, overwhelming pain, erupting in his leg from a wound he could not identify. He couldn't feel his arm. A desperate part of him wondered if it was even still there. He hoped it was. Hoped it was only the boulder that was currently restricting his blood flow. His breath came in heaves, panic rising, almost suffocating with its intensity. It surprised him, really, that he was breathing at all. The third bomb was smaller than the others. It seems its sole purpose was to take out the warehouse. To take him out. He could taste copper on his tongue. It made him want to retch. Tears sprung to his unseeing eyes, a groan escaping his lips as he tried once again to lift the boulder caging him in. His limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. His entire body burned, pain flaring with every muscle he tried to use. He was going to die here, wasn't he? The thought made him feel numb. Disconnected from the reality bearing down on his entire being. Was this how it was going to end? Ku, can you hear me? The soreness in his head amplified as he tried to listen. The new presence brought overwhelming relief. The voice was familiar, achingly so. You're going to be okay. We're going to get you out of there, do you hear me? And as if calling out to someone else, you're Araka, I need you to move this boulder. The weight crushing him to the ground disappeared, as whatever was holding him down was floated into the air. A new kind of pain erupted in its place as the blood rushed to his legs. Something pressed into his wounds, his vision turning white for a moment, overtaking the previous darkness. Shit. The hero hissed from his place above him. You need to stop moving, okay? This is going to hurt. Ai Aizawa. His throat felt raw, the words sandy and stinging. A distant part of him thought it was somehow fitting that he was here. The same man who'd been there all those years ago when it all began. His vision was blurring, dark spots forming around the world. It's okay, you're going to be all right. I just need to keep applying pressure. Shouting to someone behind him, he continued. Call an ambulance. His voice cracked, shattering his composure. What do we do? Shinsu was here too. It wasn't safe. What was he doing here? His mind felt foggy, detached. Help me get him out of here. This structure isn't going to hold out for long. B but H his arm. Now Shinsu, I need you to pull yourself together. Without truly registering the words, he felt two pairs of arms wrap around him. They lifted him, the movement bringing unfiltered agony, racing through his entire body and lighting his nerves on fire. Something wet dripped onto his forehead. His mind distantly noted that it was starting to rain. That was good, right? It meant the fire would disappear. He wanted it to. They walked slowly, carefully, trying their hardest not to jostle him. However, before they could make it out of the rubble and into the open street, a rumble sounded around them. The ground shook, pebbles vibrating from their resting place at their feet. A great massive boom resounding through the air as a figure crashed into the building situated right next to them. From the dust and smoke emerged none other than All Might. The man looked worse for wear, blood sluggishly oozing from a wound on his shoulder. Dirt and grime covered him, making him look almost deranged. Another crash was heard as a new figure joined the scene. His presence alone sent shivers running down Shinsu's spine, his body freezing as if his limbs were no longer his own to control. This isn't good, we need to get out of here. Aizawa hissed, readjusting his grip until most of Izuku's weight was resting on Shinsu. Take him to the others, I need to make sure they don't see you. With that, the man took off, using his capture weapon to launch himself in the direction of the fight. Izuku was heavier than he expected, or maybe it was his own body that felt weak. It felt as though his legs would give out at any moment. As they staggered across the rubble, he couldn't help his gaze from straying towards the battle taking place near them. A crowd had formed in the distance, as if following the match. Like all hero fights, the danger didn't deter the audience. All Might and the villain were fighting with an intensity that rivaled the greatest wars. Their punches created whirlwinds, shaking the very earth with their movements. Every hit echoed through the ravaged field like thunder. Craters formed in their wake, remnants of a fight between titans. It felt surreal to watch this. Two men with powers rivaling the gods, fighting amongst the mortals. The hair on his arms stood on end as the battle raged between the two entities. It made his veins throb with a constant state of alertness. It felt as if he was never meant to witness this immense display of power. As if the events were momentous, yet forbidden to his earthly eyes. He couldn't let it consume him, though. Couldn't let the sight suck him in, swallow him completely. The fate of the boy leaning against him rested on his ability to keep moving. So he did. He pushed through the urge to remain there, as if stuck in time, and marched forward. Each step feeling heavier than the last. Kirishima and Todoroki rushed to their aid. However, before they could get to them, another rumble reverberated through the ground beneath their feet. A distant shout of, "Look out!" desperate and horrified, sounded behind them. The voice was only drowned out by the rain and the shock wave that came right at them. The impact split the concrete, separating them from the other students, almost knocking him down had he not braced himself for it. Too busy trying to remain upright, he didn't see the wave of shrapnel and rubble coming right at them. Something caught his side and pushed. The next thing he knew, he was tumbling down. Skidding across the ground, skin scraped raw as he rolled across the dirt. Wheezing as the breath was knocked out of him, he didn't give himself a moment to rest. His body already moving to get up, to check on Izuku. Make sure he was okay. The first thing his mind registered was All Might's triumphant position. His hand was held high, fist pointing at the sky as he heaved. Aizawa standing a couple of feet next to him. The crowd roared, loud and overwhelming to his ringing ears. Yet, even as the noise heightened and the chaos reigned, he could focus on nothing else. It felt like they were the only people frozen in a bustling crowd, standing there, as if in the eye of a hurricane. Suddenly the world felt muted, as if all sound were suddenly dimmed, as though they were drifting aimlessly underwater. He watched, as though in slow motion, as blood spluttered from Izuku's lips, a soundless cry spilling from his throat as his knees gave out. The crimson red seemed to draw him in until it was all he could see, as the boy's body crumbled to the ground like a rag doll whose strings had been cut. One hand, his only remaining one, his mind noted morbidly, heart-wrenchingly, was outstretched towards him, still in the motion of pushing him away. That sight would forever be engraved in his mind, a picture straight out of his nightmares. He felt hollow, unmoved as he realized just what had happened. A metal rod was sticking out of Izuku's chest, his soot-covered costume rapidly darkening with blood. With a detached kind of horror, he saw a small smile stretch across Izuku's features, as if the teen was pleased, satisfied. His body moved even as his mind reeled, limbs feeling steadier than his psyche as he stumbled towards the boy's fallen body. This was not happening. It couldn't be. The rain was beating down on them, a tangible curtain forming around them, blocking out the rest of the world. All he could hear was Izuku's faltering breath. All he could see was his pale, broken body lying on the ground before him. "No, no, no," he whispered desperately. "Stay with me, where's the ambulance?" He screamed at no one and everyone, wide, hysterical eyes looking up at his gathered classmates. Uraraka had a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob as she huddled into Ida's side. Bakugo was shouting at someone on his phone. His rage reverberated through Shinsu himself, a perfect picture of the storm that brewed within him. He wanted to scream at them some more, tell them there was no reason to look that heartbroken. Izuku he would make it out of here. Why did they look so sad? With delicate, tentative movements, he cradled the boy's upper body, letting Izuku's head rest on his folded legs. Trembling fingers came up to push the teen's hair out of his eyes, tears already spilling down his cheeks. It felt wrong to touch him, as if at any second he would break, shatter along with the boy, holding him in his arms like fragile glass. "Hi, Hitos," Izuku's chest convulsed, trying in vain to expand and failing miserably. "Why?" his voice broke. "Why would you do that?" And he knew even then that Izuku wouldn't have even given it a second thought. It didn't stop him from feeling as though a part of his soul was crumbling into dust. I'm not sorry. Blood was pooling on the ground under them now. The liquid mixed with the rain and seeped into his clothes. The cold he was feeling had nothing to do with it, however. "Don't talk. Why, you're going to be all right. You're going to be fine. Do you hear me?" His voice was breathy, hysterical. "Everything's going to be fine." His heart felt like it was being shredded into pieces, washed away with the downpour along with the tears that slid down his face, indistinguishable from the rain. It's okay." The words were broken and faltering. The pain was now evident on the teen's features, his eyebrows scrunching with agony despite the smile showing his bloodied teeth. His eyes, though, his pale green eyes, were clearer than he'd ever seen them before. It reminded him of that day, all those months ago, standing in the rain. I was never meant to lie I've this long. Stop. You're not going to die. Do you understand? You're not allowed to die on me. Why, you promised you wouldn't? He couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. They had promised each other. They had so much left to do. They were supposed to have more time. "You promised," he repeated feebly, another sob racking his body as he clutched desperately at his fading love, afraid he would disappear at any moment, wash away with the rain. He could hear Yayurazu and Kirishima openly crying now. Bakugo was silent, however, crouched near them on Izuku's right, his phone held loosely in his hand as if he'd forgotten about it, eyes trained aimlessly on the ground. "Where are the medics? Come on. Someone go get them already. What's taking?" A touch to his cheek made him falter, gaze immediately drawn back to the boy shaking in his hold. The touch was feeble, as light as a feather, surely leaving a blood trail in its wake. It brought warmth to his chest, even as it threatened to tear his heart apart. Izuku's eyes were somehow meeting his own now. The calm green pulled him into their depth, as if by a trance. "It's raining." Hi, Hitoshi." A small, fragile smile stretched the boy's face, bloodied yet no less precious. He could feel it, the last remnants of life tethering this boy to the waking world, unraveling like loose threads on a torn tapestry, as brittle as powdery sand, slipping through his fingers. He could see it, the exact moment life seemed to drain from those emerald eyes. The moment the last breath of air escaped his failing lungs. He could feel it in his very bones, as if he was the one lying there, wasting away right before his eyes. I'll always hoped it would rain. The pain he felt, snaking into his heart, was unbearable, making him want to howl into the night. Scream at the world for this unfairness, for this cruelty. No. He pulled the boy closer to his chest, head burrowing into the boy's neck, wanting nothing more than to be close to him, to have him open his eyes and talk to him. Please, and no. He wanted anything. Anything but this empty vessel he was clutching onto like a lifeline. His body heaved with unsuppressed sobs as he wept with everything he had. What are you doing? Get him up. Sirens flared in the distance, but his mind barely registered it. He didn't bother to look up at Bakugo. He couldn't bring himself to tear his gaze away from the boy in his arms. The medics are almost here. The rain beating down on them made the boy's hair fall over his eyes, making him look almost deranged. Hey man, don't, Kirishima's cried feebly. What the hell is your problem? Do you want him to die? The blonde shouted back, tone frantic as he got closer. Shinsu's arms unconsciously tightened around the body in his grasp. Stop. The whisper sounded broken even to his own ears. It's over. And the words felt thick, wrong to his throat. Just stop. He looked up then, sorrow and a deep coiling sense of sadness burning in his eyes, as he pleaded for Bakugo to understand. He's gone. He watched the moment reality seemed to settle over the boy, like a weight too heavy for any of them to bear. It brought him down onto his knees as a scream louder and harsher than he's ever heard tore itself out of his lungs as he punched the ground in his anger, splashing the water beneath on contact. It filled the air with anguish, sending vibrations echoing into Shinsu's very soul, only making him want to cry harder, to disappear, to no longer exist. It was there, under the heavy rain, cold and unforgiving, that Shinsu lost everything he ever loved. Light shinned through the thinly veiled fabric hanging on the walls, separating the room from the outside world, as if time was meaningless here. Inconsequential. The moon was high in the sky, clear and void of any cloud or blemish. There, amid the darkness, inside an abandoned drawer rests a paper and a red pen. The former was creased and frayed with time, stained with tears and ink on its yellow-brown surface. 2 different scrawls adorn it. A blue childlike scribble, clumsy and written with crayon, and another straighter, more eligible red handwriting. Despite the pathetic state of the paper, it is treated as the most precious of treasures, held only with reverence and love. There's a small checklist on it, a bucket list, trivial, silly things, a desire to do something reckless, a desire to save, to help. All of them were marked as completed, checked. One item was streaked, as if the boy had tried to erase it, but failed. The wish to become a hero. Next to that blue discarded wish, the words "become a hero" were written in red, marking them as achieved. And finally, on the bottom, in a blue childish scrawl, were the words, "X fall in love." The box next to them was marked as checked. And with that, I'll see you all in the next series. For those who are interested, we have a Discord down below. Be sure to aim for the stars, drink plenty of water, and for us to cause chaos. With that, take care until next we see each other again.